Great.
I have got butterflies, and I think they're excitement, but they're also a little bit nerves.
Why?
You know how they can be both. They're a little bit both.
Yes, I do know that. I know that very well. I've actually spent my entire life trying to navigate the difference between, what is excitement and what is genuine anxiety.
And proper full-on fear.
Yes.
Head in the storm.
Yeah.
But Minnie, can I introduce you? And then we're going to have our lovely conversation. And I am so thrilled that you're here. And I feel like I know you quite well because I've done a lot of reading and listening and watching. It's so nice.
Well, thank you.
So Minnie Driver is a woman of many parts, an Oscar-nominated actress, famous films like Circle of Friends and Good Will Hunting, numerous TV roles, including Riches and Will and Grace. And she's also a singer with 3 studio albums, a podcaster, Minnie Questions with Minnie Driver, and an author, Managing Expectations, a memoirish book of stories of her life. She's also a daughter, a sister, a mother, a partner, and a best friend. That's so. Welcome, Minnie. You are the first guest on my new podcast. And when I was thinking about you, I was thinking that is a lot of identities and a lot of roles. And you said in your book, your brilliant book, Minnie Driver, Managing Expectations, that you're very good at pretending to be people. But this book isn't pretending. It's powerful in its honesty, and it's funny, and it's raw and hugely touching and emotional. And it's sort of very emotional and open and beautifully written. It's a beautiful book. So I hope we'll spend some time talking about that, as well as, well, there's a lot of you. I mean, there's all of you in the book, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there is actually. It's undiluted me. I mean, edited somewhat, but not censored really. It was very cathartic. It was very therapeutic writing it, and immensely enjoyable. A lot, which ran alongside how incredibly hard it is to write a book. So it was interesting oscillating between things being very hard and very good, and I realized that is a perfect analogy for my life, and maybe it's everybody's life. But it brought it into really bold relief that things really can be 2 things. It can be very, very hard, and it can be very, very wonderful in tandem.
That 2 things could be completely true, but also there was roller coasters, wasn't there? There was times of sort of peak experiences, which I guess were hard in themselves because they're peak, because even having a heightened experience isn't always just a good thing, but also quite a lot of crashes and burns. And I was wondering, through it all, what do you think is the kind of greatest challenge that you've had to face or are facing?
I think, so funny, I was talking with me in the way of, if one thinks about there being 2 me's, there are clearly more than that, but 2 me's, the one who is the observer, who can just take the hawk's eye view and can see everything and go, this lesson, you've seen this, you've lived this. And then there seems to be the physical me in this reality who sometimes is completely incapable of knowing. I see the big hole in front of me. I know that I'm going to fall right in it if I continue. And yet it seems or feels like I am powerless to do anything except fall in that big hole. And all I've noticed as I've grown older is that it just takes me less time to get out of the hole. And I've got more tools. I've got some carabiners and some pickaxes and some crampons in the bottom of the hole, and now I can get out. But I think that's what's so hard, is that I feel like there are certain parts of me that they're apparently like held in amber, it doesn't look like they're ever really going to evolve. And so this more evolved part of me has to accommodate that and go, okay, then I'm going to be as smart as I can around these difficult parts of me that through trauma or through whatever the reason is, don't look like they're ever going to let go of their hold on things being hard. So that's a long-winded way of going, I am my worst enemy, but I don't like the word enemy. I get in my way.
And it also sounds like you really know yourself, so that you have this third eye where you can come from wisdom and knowledge, and you have this kind of internal, powerful response that doesn't really listen to the third eye and kind of thrusts you into environments and places. And in some ways, what it makes me think of is that the body remembers, the body holds the score, in the sense that it works so much faster than your thinking brain, because you said it might be trauma. But also from how you're even speaking, it feels like there's I don't know if it's a part or a sort of something in you that kind of wants to go to the edge, that wants to go in, that gets something from the intensity of it, from the expansion of the experience, or somehow chipping of learning to have your tools.
Well, I wonder, like, is it, I'm really interested as to whether that is, how much is learned and how much is just a person's personality and a character. Like, there are aspects of my child who is the human that I've watched most closely develop, like forensically. And there are just certain traits that Henry came into this world with that I know he is going to have his whole life. So I don't know if it was circumstance in me that got me comfortable with jumping off the cliff and going, this is terrifying and exhilarating. And actually it gives me something, but it's also so awful and brings me so much pain. I don't know if that was learned or if I genuinely came in with that strange kamikaze inclination. I ponder it, but I also feel like, or I've reached the point of going, well, I don't know if I'm ever going to get to figure out which one it is. I've just got to deal with that being true, that I'm a rank catastrophizer, but that also I secretly might like it, which is awful because everyone else has to put up with it,
I mean, it feels like in some ways you're befriending this, which has also really worked for you, because it's meant you've gone to places that somebody who didn't go to the edge and fly off, doesn't take risks. It has kind of been in your favor too. And the thing that I was thinking about, is it inherited? Is it, I think it's probably iterative, that we are born with a predisposition and then we grow and develop more aspects of ourselves given our environment. And it was quite interesting. You were talking about being a kamikaze pilot and jumping off the edge. And of course, where I'm going, your dad was an RAF pilot in the war.
Yeah.
And was a kamikaze pilot in a way. I mean, he risked his life many times a day, I guess.
He did. So I've been so, I don't know what the word is, but ever since I found out, he was meant to have died on the day that he actually died. He was meant to have died on December 18th, 1939, when he was 18, flying in this first terrifying, deadly air battle of the Second World War, of which he survived, and he saved 4 men and received like the highest, but ditched in the North Sea in the coldest winter, didn't know, like the plane, engines had all gone. They were crash landing. He was definitely going to die. And yet he didn't. And he not only didn't die, but he saved these men and then lived with survivor's guilt. But then he actually did die on December the 18th, 2009.
Wow.
And I've been so sort of consumed with that, with that idea that I think it followed him in a way his whole life. That also that notion of just facing what most of us feel like is unfaceable, And in a way, he took that with him into the whole of his life, whereby any emotional distress that Dad experienced caused a much bigger reaction than one might have thought comparable to what was happening. And I never understood it until I did this documentary, Who Do You Think You Are? And I went through his war record with a historian and then with a doctor who explained what PTSD looked like. And it was extraordinary. And I realized how much he carried. And I wonder about that, the notion of epigenetics, you know, that which is it is passed down. I'm actually only just really realizing that as I'm saying it. Like it's very, very similar. I have a very similar reaction to emotion that my dad had.
And epigenetics is passed down in two ways. It's passed down in your genes, that your genes in response to an external threat are wired to be more sensitive and take you to fight, flight, or freeze faster. So it switches off your thinking faster, which describes what you said at the beginning. But also we learn how to deal with difficulty by observing our parents. And your dad, I mean, that episode of him posting you on a plane to Miami because he couldn't withstand your conflict.
Yeah.
That is like blowing himself up, if you know what I mean. And it feels like that because he saved 4 lives and yet he had survivor's guilt. So I'm not quite sure about that. But also, from what I've understood from your mum, who is this amazing woman, she was quite dramatic. You witnessed dramas all of the time.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And what's interesting from an adult's point of view is realizing as a child, you do not see them as anything other than godheads, your parents. You don't see them as human beings. There's no context. There just is this, it's like it's empirical, the way that they behave. That is your ideology. That is your
map.
identity.
It's all you know.
It is. It's 100%. And you got, one is so lucky if you find ways to be able to see that. I think that's what means that you can actually have a relationship with your parents later on in life, once you've come to realize that they are human beings who are having their own human experience, dealing with all of their trauma, whilst also being able to accommodate. It was still very hard for me as a child and hold those two things to be true, that they were still dealing with the children that they were. But at the time, it's much more precarious and certainly much more emotionally damaging. But, I feel like I know that my mum and dad were emotionally damaged too. It's that Philip Larkin poem. They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. Like we all do that. And it's really just the measure of, I think, how much you can make your peace with that as I grew older.
And it feels like, certainly with your mum, I mean, you don't talk that much about your dad, although he sounds like a hell of a character.
Yeah, he was.
When your mum talked about being a shit mother, you were clear to her that you really loved her. But I guess the difference in how we are frail and faulty, and we make our own mistakes. But the difference between you and your parents is that you now have a language to name what's going on inside you, to describe some of that geography. And they had no idea. Like, they were kind of pretending every day to be grown up, and every day being kind of thrown into this terrifying kind of place by external events, or how the external events triggered their internal traumas.
I mean, what do you think, Julia, with the sort of the strange purgatory? Because I noticed it in my mother and I feel it myself. When you have done some work and read books and pursued retreats and gone inward and examined, and you're aware of these pitfalls, whether in your own character or just being a human being wandering around this planet. So having this awareness, but then also feeling powerless to actually do something about it. Like it's, you know, I don't think my father followed the same self-inquiry that my mother did, but I don't know that he was any happier. And because I wonder what is the piece between seeing the choices that you make that are based on whatever they're based on, making your peace with that, and then actively adjusting whatever needs to be adjusted to have a different experience. What is that piece that needs to happen?
Well, I think you're doing it, and part of it was in writing the book and finding a language. And I've heard you talk to Henry, that the way you talk to Henry is that you have an emotional language together and he can say it back to you. So, I mean, if your question is, can we fix our early traumas and so that we live in a kind of more balanced way? I think we will always get thrown to the wounds, but I don't think we can remove the wounds that happen to us. And I think our default will always go there. But I think in having your tools, you know, yours is kind of being able to name what's going on and having a narrative. The story you tell yourself is the person you become. And I could feel it as you were writing your book, that you can make sense of yourself through yourself, and the story you're telling yourself is changing. And also, I think in the book, I felt that you were recognizing you have this incredible power, you know, that didn't get destroyed by being ticked off by your dad or moved around a lot and living a slightly kind of precarious life with full of love, but precarious with your mum.
Yeah.
But that your innate self has really worked for you as well. And that people talk about post-traumatic growth, that those that have had mini traumas, like you've had, you know, traumas with a little t, if you find a way of living with them and you recognize you survive them, it doesn't mean that they haven't been difficult or you don't recognize the pain of them. But in recognizing that you have survived them, that feels like growth. And that you feel stronger than you thought you were.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. It's so interesting, the idea of, I wonder why we do that, of the thought that we could somehow remove the wound. And I know it seems so clear when you say it like that, but I feel like we're all skewed towards this idea of 100%, like the idea that we could remove that thing, as opposed to that wound is that wound, and what grows is us and our relationship with it, and getting sucked back into it is actually just pretty typical to go, yeah, this is where you're going to go to, but then also, okay, well, I'm going to have this arsenal of tools with which to deal with it when I find myself in this, you know, recognizable landscape.
And that thread runs through almost everything you say, that I get thrown off, I feel out of control, I'm terrified, I go to raves in order to stabilize, I go to America, I do dangerous things, I go and try and rescue my house with a complete stranger, and I survive. And sometimes I thrive, and I have moments of enormous joy and love. And that you hold those things, moving between them, having feels like more stability in how to stabilize yourself. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Than you did, because before you just were thrown.
Yeah, it was scattering seeds and then living out the reality of whatever they say in the Bible. You know, some fall on stony ground, some fall on fertile ground, but living each experience, which is exhausting. It really is exhausting. But, you know, funny and interesting, I suppose, to have found a profession where you can profit off that. You can actually make money out of being able to feel a series of emotions, huge emotions, very quickly, translate those, express them, articulate them, make people feel things that they don't want to have to actually feel. So you're this, you know, you become this proxy. But what is weird as an actress, that you can sort of become a proxy to your own life, and eventually you do have to pay that bar tab. I think if you're lucky, you know.
So one of my questions is, what do you think it was about the experience that was particularly challenging for you, of you being in relation to you? And is this the answer, that you learned to be these different identities in these roles, but you hadn't found an integrated way of being yourself? Is that the bar tab? What
I
was
think
so challenging about it?
I think that so if you have the baseline of insecurities and things that, I write about it a bit in the book, of always feeling like, the found traveler child to my mother and my sister's cool, blonde, leggy cabal. And then, so my identity was already fractured and insecure. You then become an actor where you're playing all these different parts. So you're being given the opportunity to constantly explore people other than yourself.
In a
Which
profession, by the way,
yeah.
You said you have to win the lottery each bloody time.
And so
you have to get the role.
Yeah. And you're dealing with constant rejection. So it's like, so the real me, the me that goes into audition, she constantly gets rejected. So when you get a role, that is acceptance. So that role then becomes your everything. And that person that you're playing is your way out of all of the other shit. And it means you don't have to deal with that shit for a while.
It's a brilliant escape.
So then only working, which is what I did for a really long time. My sweet friendships fell by the wayside. My family was really the only constant thing, but I was just a work machine, because just lily padding from job to job to job offered this way of continuing to explore identity and people whilst never really having to deal with myself. But it obviously catches up with you, and it would come out in my relationships with men. Like so you'd think, oh, well, the best thing that I could do to give myself a life outside of working is to have a relationship, because everybody's supposed to get married, even though my parents never did. Everybody's supposed to be loved. And if you're loved, and if someone gives you that label, then again, I'm not going to have to go and excavate all of that painful stuff. So it was really, but which is a bit like very sweetly bashing your head against the wall, and it's like the universe or God or whatever you want to call it will just sort of let you do that, or the circumstances of just being alive. Like you can go and explore all those things, but then there is a moment at which you just sit sort of bloodied and bruised and go, why am I continuing to do this thing? And again, if you're lucky, you get to have that reckoning of, I have absolutely no idea what to do. I don't want to continue in that direction. I'm scared of looking back at that. What do I do? And you're ultimately faced with yourself. And again, I think if you're lucky, you find your way through that and you come out the other side. But I do understand why a lot of people turn to drugs and alcohol. I understand why people have multiple relationships, where they get married hundreds of times. Like, I completely understand the wanting to stay distracted from one of the central tenets of being a human being, which is you're going to have to face yourself. You're going to have to,
I mean, that's such a beautiful way of describing it, isn't it? That you were given opportunities that in a way it is like an addiction, or it's self medication. It's anesthetizing yourself against. Hang on, I'm just stopping a sec. I thought I'd turn my phone off. Let me just, there we are. Resume. That's such a beautiful way of describing it. And what I kind of was thinking about as you were talking is that you recognize, like all of us use busyness as a self-medication to not face ourselves and look at ourselves. And with you, it's for a huge span of time, and that you formed relationships within those times, which were never real relationships in a way, because they were when you had taken on a role.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until you had a reckoning that you were forced to look at Minnie internally. And kind of my understanding is that pain is the agent of change. The things that we do to block the pain is over time the thing that does us harm.
That's exactly
because
right.
It completely, we don't have the opportunities to work out what we're blocking.
But we want to avoid pain, and we're taught to avoid pain at all costs. At all cost. Pain is not presented as this extraordinary teacher. You know, it's really interesting. Like, we'll do anything to avoid it. Telly, booze, weed,
Culture, the shopping,
culture, the shopping,
big
the internet,
houses,
anything to not actually just stop and I wonder.
feel.
And I think maybe that's like the acting thing. What I love about it so much is that there's this really this exploration of art that exists, so you can dive into that pain, and it's being underwritten as art, but it's like, until you recognize that it's the exploration of pain and not just the presentation, of a beautiful film or a performance, and it isn't purely performative, then I think when I realized that, things became way more interesting. I'm not saying that they necessarily became easy, but they certainly became more enjoyable to go, this is both things.
It isn't easier. It's real. You feel alive. I mean, it felt, as much as you were suffering in this high kind of octane state, that time you woke up in Radstock, and Radstock's about 2 miles from here. I know Radstock. I know that chemist. I had my COVID vaccine at that chemist.
Oh, no way. That's so funny. I mean, seriously, like these huge moments.
But you were at as far as I could make out, that was that reckoning. You'd had amazing highs, car crash, amazing highs, car crash. At the end of lots of highs, lots of car crashes. The women in your life, your mother, your sister, people picked you up. And that, I think, probably, as you said, enabled you to survive. That was the thing that helped you, was the women in your life. But at the lowest point, then this miracle happened.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, really, genuinely, waking up on January 1st and going, I can't bear it. I can't bear another year of doing this thing. So you've come to a complete collapsed stop in a bathtub on January 1st.
And people say, or maybe it's therapists or people, a breakdown is a breakthrough. So at that moment, you thought, I can't do this. And so something had shifted already.
Yes. Something that's exactly right. Something had shifted, and I didn't know I was pregnant. So it had already, but it was so interesting to like have that moment when the next chapter was already being written. Like, what's so beautiful and what we forget when we're in agony is that there is another story that is a filament away from us. It was a membrane away from me. It's always right there. Like, that runs the good story, the opposite story, the story that leads you out of the one that is most painful is always right there. And we don't remember that. If we're lucky, maybe we have someone going, I need to remind you of the other story that is happening right alongside this current one. It's right there. And I don't know exactly what you have to do to get into that story, but I want you to remember that it's there so that you don't feel so isolated in your pain. Like, go through it, keep going. When you're going through hell, keep going.
It is that thing, isn't it? It's so impossible. Like, if you're in the weather, if you can imagine that feelings are like weather, when you're in the eye of the sort of snowstorm and the hail is in your face and you haven't got enough clothes on and your feet are cold, you never, ever believe it's going to be spring again, or that you're going to have warm feet. And if only we had, because when you're in it, of course, your thinking and your memory are switched off because you're in a heightened state. So you're only in fight or flight or freeze. So you have no capacity to recall on your wisdom, your knowledge, your connections, your love, because that is all switched off. Memory is switched off. You're just there to survive. And of course, survive is no place to really live and be in. We need to feel safe, to feel warm and loving and connected and creative. And if only we could just kind of tap something on our heads and go, remember, remember.
Do you know, I did this thing when we accidentally moved to England during COVID because my son wanted to go to school and the schools had stayed shut in Los Angeles through the whole of 2020. They never opened. So we came to do a term in England, which then turned into, can I finish out the year here? During that time, my mother died and everything just felt very, very dark. And I remember being in Hyde Park. I looked at this tree and I realized that I'd taken a picture of it the previous summer when we'd arrived. And I had this picture and I was standing in front of this tree feeling like I was going to die because I couldn't bear the sadness of my mother. It was the winter in England. I was so far away from California and my home and my books and my bed and everything that I'd known in 26 years. And I looked at this tree and I just got the picture out on my phone of the tree in the summer. And I was like, okay, it can look like that. It currently looks like this.
Wow. It's your touchstone.
Yeah. And it's actually it's actually quite a good thing. It's how I've managed to suffer through the British winters, which I do think can be analogous for anything hard in your life, because there's not much harder than this cold, grey, freezing, wet, direly dark time. And I looked at this thing and went, it will change. It will change. It's going to change. It's not going to change today. It's not going to change today, but perhaps adding in the idea that there is an evolution to this moment will make it more bearable. And I do believe it did. It doesn't fix it. It doesn't, the idea of getting to joy from that moment is, I think, where we get a bit lost thinking, I've got to feel better. If you can just feel fractionally better, that admits the idea that it can change and it will change. It's just you have to have a bit of patience.
And it's almost like if you can have that tiny, tiny light that can give you a tiny hope, that image of a spring tree. You don't have to believe it. You don't have to know it's going to happen, but you can just have that kind of image. Something shifts in that moment, that this isn't all, although it's really terrible now. And knowing that enables you to kind of sustain or survive.
Yeah.
This
it's not the whole story.
Incredible pain. It's not the whole story. Yes, it's not the whole story. This isn't the end.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, there's quite a lot of punishing that goes on, I've realized, in the wake of grief. Like I would get so frustrated when I would have days where I didn't feel like I'd enjoyed anything, because my punishing thought would be, you're literally going to be dead so soon, and you just wasted another day being sad and feeling awful. And it was so I did actually sit down and deal with that one because it was so brutal, but and then turned that idea of mortality into more of an engine rather than a punishment. But that is the strangest thing that I had never really been aware of. When Mum died, and that bulwark, I mean, I talked about it a bit in the book, I didn't realize that was going to happen. This bulwark between me and my own mortality was going to be removed. And suddenly this terrifying rush of fear that I was next was then going to be looming. And part of the more active part of my own grieving process has been turning that thought of it being this terrifying thing into, I'm going to use that as an engine and even if my day is that the best thing that happens in my day, not even, but if the best thing that happens in my day is me walking on the beach, just going for a walk, then I'm going to consciously make that my beautiful, and this is how I lived moment of my day. If it's making myself scrambled eggs on toast, it's not like every day has to have a 3-ring circus in it, but somehow that changing the mindset of I wasted something to I was aware of it. And by making it conscious, I made it valuable and valid. But I had to experience a lot of feeling like my life was completely meaningless in order to get to that.
And in some way, you know, that is what you kind of learn from it. And it feels like what you learn from it, that by going into it, not avoiding it, doing lots of volts, by allowing yourself to feel the awfulness of that pain. And the thing about grief, people so often turn against themselves and attack themselves.
Yeah.
It's a cruel nature of grief that somehow you're doing it wrong, and we're not compassionate with ourselves. Like, oh, I really miss my mum. I love my mum, and my hurt and pain is equal to my love. And that is a massive, great hole in me. That is a mum-shaped hole that I'm missing. But it feels like because you stayed with it, you allowed yourself to go into it, and that freed you in some ways to move between the kind of loss orientation where you felt the pain to the restorative orientation, which is this movement in grief is between loss and restoration, where you could paradoxically say, with that bulwark missing, I'm going to make damn sure I'm living my life to the full. And that means I can just feel the sand on my feet on the beach or swimming. I don't have to win an Oscar every day, but I'm really going to embrace each day, because mortality means more to you now, because you really know what death feels and looks like. Death isn't this funny thing that happens to other people.
I genuinely, and even through the loss of my father,
I was thinking
it didn't hit me in the same way. And maybe it's because when you still have one parent, who is between you and that thing. But so it's really the death of the second parent, whether that's your mother or your father, that precipitates that feeling of free fall towards something that you want protection from, but that protection has been removed. And it's very frightening. It's like you feel
grief feels like fear, doesn't it? It does really feel like
it does, because I'd never heard anyone talk about that specific thing. And I started asking my friends, and I was like, do you feel so frightened by the idea of your own death now, like that you'd never thought about it before? And to a person, they said yes. That we're,
and it's not, I mean, those of us weirdos who are in the death community, we know it, but in the general population, the ignorance about death and grief and what it's like and what's normal, you feel like you're going mad and you're terrified, you feel your mortality, and you feel like death is entering into you in some ways, don't you, viscerally? That is not out in the world. And so every time someone is bereaved, which everybody will be, it's like they don't have a map. It's like being you when you were 8 years old being sent to Miami. They have no map or landscape of like, oh, you feel frightened. Oh, you feel like you're going to die. Oh, it feels like you're going mad. Oh, it means you don't sleep or eat, or you do all of those things in reverse. It's just not out there. But I think your book helped get it out there.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean,
Can I say one thing about you? I interrupted you. I'm not meant to do that.
Go ahead. I don't mind.
I was quite interested at the end of your book, which I imagine was written very soon after your mum died. And you said, I won't say goodbye. And you also didn't actually say she died.
Yeah. It was at that, it's really interesting because the last chapter of my book is basically the day, because she died from the point at which there was even vaguely something wrong to the point of her dying was 14 days. And I wrote it in
crazy,
in
it's like
the form of like a of a diary in a way, because I remember etched into me, and part of my grieving process, and I didn't know if it was going to make it into the book, was I had to write down, almost so I could read it to know that it happened. This is what happened. I was in Waitrose when I got the call that something was very, very wrong. so going through it, her last night, which was on a Saturday,
Mm.
and when I came to thinking, like, I know exactly what happened on that Sunday. I know as forensically as I knew what happened on every other day. I know exactly how that went down to her last breath, to my first one in the world without her. But it was like I'd reached the edge of what I wanted to share or was able
Yeah.
to share, I think, publicly. So the
It's a very
idea
intimate
of
moment, isn't it? Intimate death.
it is. It's like birth. I mean, it is birth. It is. It is birth. It is that. It was the same experience. So strangely, the same experience of this complete miracle of how was this person born? How did I make this? I am watching this person come out of me. I made a person in my body. How is this possible? It was as miraculous and extraordinary to go, where is this beautiful person going? This person
Mm.
who made me, where are they exiting to? In the same way that I watched my son's entrance. And maybe exits and entrances are also very thematic in my life as an actor.
I didn't think of
But,
that.
you
But
know,
the miracle of it, and the sort of that we don't know, and yet in surrendering to not knowing frees us to embrace it and allow that death is a kind of birth. And it's you learning to be a completely new version of yourself, you without a living mum.
yeah.
And that having Henry is a new version of yourself, learning to be a mum.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's the mirror, it's the mirror image. You know, it's that wild bookend. You know, that's why the alpha and omega is always life and death. But we are very I think it dovetails. It's funny going back to something that you said about the avoidance thing. I think it's about in the same way that we avoid pain. Like pain is also so fear is part of pain. And we fear death. Like people fear death, which is why they don't want to examine the idea of their mortality. It's like, no thanks. That is not something I want to look at because it's too frightening. And it's funny, it's like people want to feel. That's why they go to the movies. It's why I have a job. People love going to horror films. They want it to be external. They want to be able to have, in a way, you can have control over it. If you're in a movie theater, if you're watching television and it's happening to someone else, you can observe it and somehow experience it without actually having to experience it. That's when I start understanding whatever books I've read about, like the kind of shamanistic aspect of acting, where someone is doing it for you in order for you to be able to experience it and survive it. But like, what does that mean for the actor?
You tell me.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's why it's like it's become really, mum dying really like helped me examine what that is. I mean, I started doing it in the book. That's why it's so interesting that she died in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And it really was another extraordinary gift that she gave me, was being able to, it's like, okay, no, you've started to pull the thread on this sweater, but you're not actually getting really, you're in here. You can get really, 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 really deeply into it with this. And, it was a huge gift. It was hugely healing for me. Like I wish I could have shared more of that healing with my sister and my brother. I really do. Um, it's very hard watching your siblings go through grief as well.
Yeah. Well, emotions are contagious, which is why they kind of transmit across the screen, but also with each other. And when you know each other, you read it and feel it. And what I was aware of was when you were talking is in that, your relationship with your mum, in recognizing she's died, it's also an ongoing relationship. Like she's part of you. The love for her never dies. She influences you as a mum. And if I'm right, what I get from what you're saying is that she's also influencing you from beyond the grave about how you act, how you become who you are, now that you've had this kind of reworking through grief?
Yeah. I mean, I mean, who knows what will happen with it, but the book that I want to write, or that I've started,
Great.
sketching out, is the one liner would be, no one talks about the relationship that begins with the person you love after they're dead. And the exploration of that and all of these things, which, it just takes reading one letter in their personal effects to
To
blow
have
your
her.
mind. And because they're right there, but also what's being revealed. There is absolutely no way of ever having a further conversation, actively, to go, what does this mean? You have to find your own relationship with a, you have to find resolve. And it's weird because it feels like it would be one hand clapping because you're here and they're not. But the strange thing is, they are there.
She is there.
There is, it's just a different frequency. And it's kind of an interesting, I'm very interested in exploring that idea, because I can't be the only person who feels that.
No, I mean, I can
Yeah.
see it in your face, the depth of what you were feeling. Is this
Mm.
like, this is new territory internally, and so it feels quite tender in a way, like you want to be tender towards it in finding your new relationship with your mum, which is co-created. She is part of you. It's not just you on your own making it up. Is that she is viscerally, genetically, memory, and in every way part of you. And it's how you find ways of her living in you and having touchstones to her memory, whether it's a letter or her ring or a photograph or a smell as you walk along the beach, that you find a new way of incorporating her into your life.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because the hard things about your parent don't, there's this deification that happens right when they die, where they are just this perfect being. But then what I think is funny and hilarious and great and difficult is also that the hard things about them don't stop being hard. Your relationship to those hard things about your dead loved one don't stop being hard. You have to keep, like, it, that's interesting territory. And like you said, it's tender, but it's also really funny, which is that's my favorite confluence.
Yeah.
Tenderness, humor, drama, like all
And
those
funny.
things, and fun, like really funny,
And
like
quite
it's
dark humor.
definitely, like it really, it really did precipitate. It was precipitated by reading a letter that just blew my mind, that my mother had done this thing that I didn't know about. And the fact that I couldn't ask her about it is just, it was so astonishingly hard to begin with. And I was so enraged, and it's become funnier and funnier, which then you go, okay, well, now I've managed, that's gone through the correct filters. Now I could actually write about that and be really angry, and it also be really funny.
So you
Um,
process, in our lingo,
yeah,
you
you can
processed
process
it.
it.
And that your relationship with her is built. If someone sends you a picture of her that you haven't seen, or when you hear a new story, a new letter, so it grows and evolves your relationship, and wanting to talk about her. So often people don't talk about the people that have died because no one bloody listens.
I know.
But
I love it. It's the
yeah,
best thing. It's the best thing ever when someone comes up and goes, um, gosh, I met your ma in 1972 in Deauville. I've got to tell you the story. And then they tell you the story that you've never heard. And it is like you've been
come
given
back.
another piece of her. Yeah. It's fantastic.
It's an
I,
amazing thing.
people are scared that you'll burst into tears. I think that's why they don't.
And you might,
And that's the thing. Like, you might, but nobody thinks that's okay, except, I
but
think,
you're not going to die. It's not. I think people think death is contagious, that if you talk about it, somehow they're going to catch it.
well, I found that with like I felt incredibly resentful for quite a while of my friends who whose parents weren't dead, whose parents
Yeah.
were alive, and then felt really guilty about feeling that. I felt like they couldn't understand, they couldn't possibly know. And also that they were scared. I could see it in some of my friends' faces when I talk about mum dying, like this, the absolute horror, because it meant they had to think about their own parent dying. And
You were the
I,
Walking Dead Parent Club person.
you were the person who reminded them that it was going to happen to them. And there have been people who have literally, really good friends of mine, who have absolutely not been able to, will not talk about it, will not bring it up. The cursory "how are you doing" is like, yeah, I can see it in their eyes. Please don't actually tell me. Please, I'm begging
Yeah.
you.
Don't tell me how you're really
Don't tell me
feeling.
how
Just
you
say you're
really
fine.
how are you? Yeah.
But also that jealousy of people who had parents for longer, or looking at happy
Yes.
Instagram Christmas photos or Thanksgiving or New Year, all
I
of that
know.
is painful.
I know. I was with a friend yesterday who's you know, in their late 60s, and was saying, you know, I'm really starting to have to deal with it with my mom. And there was immediate a part of me that was like, for
You've
fuck's
had it
sake,
so long.
you had her so much longer. I'm not feeling bad for any of you. She's 98. And she, like, you've had her, like, fucking hell.
Get
And it's
over it.
awful like that. But then you know, I really realized how incredibly ungenerous that is. And of course, like, of
It's
course.
nothing about their mum. It's about you missing your mum.
Yeah, it is. It's that. Which is why, you know, you don't vocalize it. You don't go, just put a sock in it about your mum who's 90, you know, you don't say that. But I was interesting.
It's on the tip.
I
It's on the
noticed it.
it's on the
Like,
tip.
yeah. But I knew, like, you know, thank God, like, you know, do not say that. You don't have to say that. And also, it's okay that you feel that. You just I miss Gaynor. I miss mum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're coming to the end. Do you have
Yes.
a question for me at all?
Well, you've answered so many of my questions. How do you counsel people who do find out secrets that are hidden, new information about someone who is dead, that they are they are never going to have an answer about? Like, how do you counsel someone around that?
I think you grieve both. You grieve, say you find out your biological father wasn't your father, but the father who brought you up isn't your biological father, but your father's died, the one that brought you up.
Mm.
I think you grieve both. You grieve the father you thought that was your father. You grieve the biological father that you don't know and can't find out who they are. And you have to accommodate it. You have to come to terms with it. Because if you keep looking for answers and trying to make explanations, that is the root of direct misery. So it's like allowing yourself to feel the pain of it, naming it, feeling furious, distressed, you lose your identity, go through that grief, all the emotions, fury, sadness, all confusion, all of that. And then in the end, let that come through you. And that's what grief does. It's like storms that come through you. And in the end, you don't accept it, you accommodate it, you learn to live with it. It becomes part of your kind of fabric internally that is sore, and it can come and ignite and upset you 10 years later, but you kind of, it's part of you, becomes part of your new identity of yourself. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. That's great. Yeah, no, I mean, just talking about all of this has like helped so much, because it's really it's so interesting. It's so isolating, grief.
So
You can't think
lonely and
anyone. It's
chilly.
so, it really is, even though you know it happens to literally everybody, and yet you feel so alone in it, because I think we don't have language. We don't have this way of talking about it. Because you're right, people think it's contagious, or maybe it is contagious.
And it's a kind of magical thinking, like you said, that if I don't think about it or talk about it, then it's not going to happen to me or my mum.
Yep.
So I'll just turn
Exactly.
away.
Exactly.
Which is a loss, because then they don't, the thing you've got from your mum, I don't know that you could have had it before, is that you've changed your relationship with living. death has taught you something different about living.
Yeah, it really has. It really has. I
That's a
mean,
biggie.
yeah, it's huge. There are times that I do wish I could kind of go back to the, I mean, I know it sounds weird, but even like mummy, mummy being here aside, which is obviously what I want, is going back to this time when I didn't think about death as much, where I didn't think this is actually going to end. I'll be separated from my son. I won't see the sunrise. I won't be able to surf. It's, there are times when but I think I am in process of, I'm still grieving hugely. It's been like a
Yeah.
year. It's just a
It's early
different,
days.
it's
It's
a
a
different
different,
stage.
yeah.
So I'm hoping to kind of come to peace with that and not feel like the meter is running all the time, and that I wish I could get back to a time when I wasn't even thinking about it. But I look forward to that. I look forward to it evolving further.
Yeah, and it will do. I mean, because you're kind of letting it do its business with you. You're letting it shape you and change you, and it adjusts you. One of the things I was wondering, and I know we've got to stop, but I want to carry on forever, is do you ever write her postcards?
Oh gosh, no, I have not done that. I haven't done that. Oh God, what would I say? That's a really. Do you? What is that? What does that do for people? Like, what has that traditionally done for people that you've recommended do that?
I mean, there's lots of, it's making what's invisible tangible. And also it gives you, because grief, as you say, is so lonely, but it's also completely invisible. You're walking down the street
Yeah.
because you're not a Victorian wearing
I'm
black
wearing
clothes
black.
or
I understand now why people did that. I so get it
get
now why
it.
they 100% it was nothing to do with like black. Like the death. It was like letting you know I am not the same. I
I'm
am not.
raw.
I am
Be
completely
nice to me.
yes. The same way that people stand up when you're pregnant on the tube. They can actually see that you might need to sit down. But it's so you're right. You walk around and everybody thinks that
They
you're
think you could have had sex 5 minutes ago. I mean, nobody
yeah.
knows any of those things.
Nobody knows anything about you.
But,
So
but,
you
but a
create
lot
the
of my
pathway.
clients wear black, by the way.
I wish now that I had done it. It's so strange. I wish that I'd done it, as I'm not someone who wears black at all, ever.
People would have recognized it as a signal.
Yeah. I really understand. You know what? That's also such a great piece of advice to give someone like one's looking for practical things to help people beyond provide food, walk the dog, do the laundry, which is really useful when
It
someone's
really
died.
helps.
That's what you really want. But someone saying, I give you permission to wear black all of the time and let me know, I will tell you that it will act like a beacon above you to alert others to your changed state.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
And love. I mean, it felt to me that it was the love of others that enabled you to survive.
You
The love of
definitely,
Addison, Henry,
definitely.
Katie, your brother,
And loving them,
and loving them. It's reciprocal.
Loving Ed and Kate through the moments where and brilliantly, when I fall apart and I call my sister, she is strong. And when she falls apart, she calls me. And we do for each other what our mother did for both of us.
That is amazing.
Yeah. Thank you
So
so
that's
much,
what your
Julie.
mum gave you.
Yeah, she did. She really did. She really, really did. She was a very, very good friend. She found her way to being a great mother, but she was always a great friend. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Minnie.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Julia. Yeah.
And
There we go.